Welcome to the Kansas Corporation Commission. I call to order the hearing in the matter of the application of Quail Oil and Gas, LLC, to authorize injection of salt water into the Arbuckle Formation at the Sly 2-6 saltwater disposal well located in Section 6, Township 17 South, Range 6 East in Morris County, Kansas, docket number 17.
The three-member panel of the Kansas Corporation Commission convened in its hearing room on Wednesday morning, August 16th, to consider matters associated with an application for a wastewater injection well in the Flint Hills. A group calling itself the Flint Hills Stewards opposes the approval of the application, launching a fundraising campaign and securing the services of Lawrence attorney Robert I. to represent them.
Oil and gas development in Kansas and elsewhere has entered a phase that requires the consideration of the effects of UI wells, underground injection wells, on seismically vulnerable areas. These protestants urge that the Commission apply the statutory authority it has to prevent earthquakes caused by this UI well and avoid the attendant harms.
A staff attorney for the KCC, Jonathan Myers, directed questions to Ray Valentine,
Good morning,
manager
Mr.
at
Valentine.
Quail Oil and Gas.
The reason you have applied for this injection well is to inject fluids that are produced from the Sager 1-6 and Sly 1-6. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And are those wells currently producing?
No, sir.
Do you know what they are capable of producing in terms of barrels of oil per day?
They're both together could produce probably 10 to 15 barrels of oil per day.
And how many barrels of salt water do you anticipate that production would result in?
Approximately 300 barrels per day.
Why is your application for 5,000 barrels per day if the wells are only capable of 300 barrels per day?
If these wells are economical, we may extend the field and do more drilling and ultimately have more water production.
You said that that's the case if these wells are economical. Are you saying that you do not know whether these wells are economic at the present time?
They were not economical hauling the salt water, the produced water off, but with the disposal well, they should be economical.
A petroleum geologist affiliated with Quail Oil and Gas, Lee Shobe, was also questioned about the application.
Mr. Shobe, if Quail Oil injects at the rates and pressures for which they've applied, is it going to cause an earthquake?
No.
Why do you say that?
I've studied the areas that have been affected by large volume injection wells, and there's nothing in the application that approaches any of the criteria available from the Kansas Corporation Commission or other studies that have been done. This well does not qualify in any way, shape, or form. In my experience, I have worked the entire Nemaha uplift from the central Oklahoma all the way up through northern Kansas, and I have mapped the faults associated with that uplift extensively, including the main fault, the Humboldt fault, and just a wide variety of other faults associated with that thrust fault.
Based upon your studies, why is it that these formations and faults are unlikely to result in earthquakes when there's injection at the rates applied for?
The areas in south central Kansas and north central Oklahoma that have experienced faults are in a much more complex structural portion of the Nemaha uplift. So for example, the fault density per township, which would be 36 square miles, is much higher. The area in Morris County is a much more benign, simple, structural complex part of the Nemaha uplift. There are much fewer faults per square mile.
A geology professor at Emporia State University, James Aber, submitted pre-filed testimony on behalf of the protestants and also answered questions at the hearing.
Good morning, Dr. Abers. If the applicant injects at the rates and pressures that it proposes in its application, is it going to cause an earthquake?
I don't know.
Nothing further.
Dr. Avers, you just testified that you don't know whether it will. What do you know concerning the relationship between the proposed well and induced seismicity?
What we're talking about here is essentially an uncontrolled experiment. We can't predict what the outcome will be. This isn't like predicting river floods where we have long historical records and we can know what the 50-year flood or the 100-year flood might be. We have a very short historical record of these induced earthquakes. We don't know what all the parameters and all the thresholds might be in every situation, so it's impossible to make predictions. In my professional opinion, though, I think there is an increased risk for induced earthquakes in this situation.
About 75 minutes into the hearing, commissioners called for a short break, following which Renee Stuckey, Director of Underground Injection Control with the KCC, took the stand to explain why he was amending his recommendations on this application.
And now that you are under oath and considering the testimony that was presented in person here today, do you have any corrections or changes to your testimony?
I maybe do have some changes in from the testimony that we've heard. I think I would recommend more that I'd recommend we approve the application at 2,000 barrels and 250 PSI. I believe from what they stated they need. That would give them plenty of room for development. Would also give them pressure if they needed to overcome gravity, and I think it would probably last for quite some time. Obviously, down the road, if they'd need to amend the application, that is always a possibility.
So the permit, if approved and consistent with your recommendation, would specify a 2,000 barrel daily limit.
Correct.
You don't know what the threshold is for volumes that would induce seismicity, do you?
No, I don't.
And if the application, if the permit is granted on the basis of staff's recommendation, it would reduce the proposed PSI to 250 from the present requested rate of 500?
Correct.
You don't know what the threshold is for pressure that would cause an induced seismic event, do you?
No, I don't.
Mr. Stuckey, the new recommendation of 2,000 barrels, what is that based upon?
As I said, I like to keep the permits within reason of what's actually going to be used, and that's really my sole reasoning for dropping it down to 2,000, because it doesn't sound like they needed anywhere close to 5,000 at this time.
As the hearing moved towards its conclusion, Robert I., the attorney for the protestants, was the first to provide a closing statement.
I would urge that there be a very cautious approach to granting this application. And as Mr. Valentine conceded, he could operate that well with no pressure. An unpressurized well at least has the benefit of less of fluids being pressurized and moving to points where they may cause slippage in the faults. So as long as we're amending positions and advancing new proposals here, I think that the commission should also consider, if you're going to grant this permit, specifying a zero pressure, because that's something that can be accepted based upon the testimony of Mr. Valentine this morning. But ultimately, a pressurized well in this area is an uncontrolled experiment, and there's no reason to engage in uncontrolled experiments in the regulatory aspect of this particular business.
The attorney for Quail Oil and Gas, Robert Vinci, cited the historical records of the U.S. Geological Survey in his closing remarks.
The testimony shows that injection wells have been used in Morris County since the 1920s, with no record of seismic activity in the area. We've gleaned the records, our geologists testified, it's in the direct testimony and the rebuttal testimony, that there is no significant or recorded seismic activity by the USGS, at least since 1950. The experiment, if you will, has been going on for quite some time without any evidence of induced seismicity in Morris County. Mr. Shobe's testimony in answer to the Commission's and staff's questions state that he looked at the Diamond Creek Fault. He looked at the other faults. He's very familiar with that lithology in the region. He looked at well borings and things in his direct pre-filed testimony, and none of it was relevant. He didn't feel like it presented any risk. In fact, he said it would be zero risk of induced seismicity.
Although the KCC staff recommends the approval of the application, the commissioners have yet to issue their final ruling.